The concept of Europe underdeveloping Africa stems from a historical perspective of colonialism and the exploitation of Africa's resources and people. Walter Rodney, in his seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, elaborates on how the wealth of Africa was utilized for European imperialist agendas which left the continent impoverished. This underdevelopment is considered an outcome of centuries of interaction with European powers who have extracted resources and hindered the continent's own growth and modernization. While the geopolitical landscape has shifted in the post-colonial era, several mechanisms by which Europe can be seen to contribute to Africa's underdevelopment persist to this day. Trade imbalances. Modern international trade often favors Europe over Africa. Europe exports high-value manufactured goods to Africa and imports raw materials at much lower prices. The tariffs Europe places on exporting agricultural goods from Africa are typically higher compared to industrial ones, serving as a barrier to African countries moving up the value chain. For instance, imported European milk powder is sometimes cheaper than local African production due to various subsidies granted to European dairy farmers, undercutting local industries in Africa. Debt and structural adjustment. Africa's post-colonial era came with a heavy reliance on foreign loans, which were used for development projects that often did not cater to the actual needs of local economies and were sometimes embezzled, leaving nations with massive debts. The European banks and governments who are the creditors, along with international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, have imposed structural adjustment policies, SAPs, as a condition for loans and debt relief. These SAPs often force African countries to cut spending on critical services like health and education, devalue their currencies to promote exports and remove trade barriers. Unfortunately, these policies have frequently resulted in social unrest, with countries like Zambia experiencing widespread protests and hardship when SAPs led to reduced government subsidies and the resultant increase in food and fuel prices. Aid dependency. Foreign aid, in which Europe has historically been a significant player in Africa, often comes with strings attached, including political and economic conditions that serve donor country interests. Some of the aid is tied, meaning it must be spent on goods and services from the donor country, or in a way that benefits the donor directly or indirectly. This can undermine local markets and perpetuate a dependency syndrome. For example, European-funded projects in Africa sometimes require the procurement of European equipment, consultants, and expertise, which not only stifles local industry but also means that a sizable portion of the aid money never actually enters the African economy. Resource extraction. Foreign direct investment, FDI, from Europe often focuses on extracting natural resources rather than building sustainable local industries. Mining operations by European companies can lead to environmental degradation, displacement of local communities, and sometimes minimal reinvestment in the host country. The Niger Delta oil exploitation by European corporations, which has caused severe environmental damage and offered little compensation to local communities, is a stark example of how Europe continues to benefit from African resources without sufficiently fueling development in return. Brain drain. The migration of skilled African professionals to Europe has resulted in a brain drain, where Africa loses the human capital it needs to grow and develop. The European health sector has consistently recruited from countries like Nigeria and Ghana, which has contributed to shortages of medical professionals in these countries. Europe benefits from the skills and knowledge of these professionals, while the education investment made in them by their home countries goes unrewarded. Political manipulation. Europe has been accused of political interference in African affairs, sometimes backing regimes that serve European interests rather than those that promote democratic governance. Supporting autocratic regimes can lead to prolonged conflicts, human rights violations, and political instability, which in turn leads to underdevelopment. The historical support of European governments for autocratic leaders in resource-rich African countries exemplifies this practice. Agricultural practices and land use. European agricultural businesses in Africa often employ methods that prioritize short-term yields over long-term sustainability. Land grabbing by European entities for commercial farming has also displaced local farmers and disrupted traditional agricultural practices. This mode of agriculture has sometimes led to soil degradation and reduced food security in countries like Mozambique, where vast tracts of arable land are leased to foreign companies. Climate change and environmental policies. Europe's industrial activities significantly contribute to global climate change, which disproportionately affects Africa. Europe's consumption pattern fuels the demand for unsustainable extraction of resources in Africa, leading to ecological damage. For instance, European nations' reliance on hardwoods contributes to deforestation in regions like West Africa. Cultural influence and education. European influence on education and culture can perpetuate a mindset that undervalues African traditions and sidelines local languages in favor of European ones. Some educational policies inherited from colonial systems may stress European history and perspectives at the expense of African experiences, thus not equipping students with the knowledge relevant to their context. Technological gap. Africa lags behind in technological advancements, partly due to restrictive patents and intellectual property laws enforced by European and Western entities. This gap is perpetuated by the fact that European countries tend to export only their outdated technologies to Africa, while keeping the latest advancements for themselves, as seen in the limited access to recent medicinal and technological developments in Africa compared to Europe. The relationship between Europe and Africa is complex and multifaceted. It's important to note that many African leaders and institutions also bear responsibility for the continent's challenges. While the legacy of historical exploitation plays a significant role, current affairs include both external influence and internal dynamics. Africa's underdevelopment is a cumulative issue that requires both global and local actors to work toward equitable approaches that allow for sustainable growth and self-reliant development for the African continent.